The Victorian era was a time when coal fires heated millions of homes. Countless tons of ash and refuse had to be removed from the bins and pails of the capital's doorsteps. And, like many jobs in the 19th century, where there was muck, there was money. Dustmen hauled ash on carts to huge dust yards, where labourers sieved and sorted through it to find metal and bone for sale. But poor men and women toiled long hours at what was hard, physical and disgusting work for a mere pittance. What's more, they were perpetually covered head to toe in grey ash, and constantly breathed dust that must have done their health no good at all. Time is a fundamental tool of change, and with it buildings, technology, culture, fashion, and, of course, people come and go. A constant to society that never seems to change, however, is the contrast between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. Though this inequality was, arguably, never so stark as it was in the past, and, in particular, so dystopian was the suffering of the Victorian era, that the adjective Dickensian, derived from the eponymous novelist, lends a fittingly dark description to 19th century poverty. This destitution was so extreme in its inequality that the poor lived cheek by jowl with the rich under their very noses, in fact, if they cared to look, but some lived in utter ignorance of its existence. Today, in an account from the 1880s by a Victorian journalist, we go back in time to discover how, in fashionable West London, desperate poverty could be found next door to the homes of the wealthy, for destitution wasn't a blight found only in the East End. Find out how, alongside the mansions of Paddington and Bayswater, some of London's poorest inhabitants toiled in filthy dust yards for a wretched income. Many of these countrymen and women who came to the capital in search of work and a better life in the City of Golden Pavement found nothing but squalor, hardship, and a life more terrible than they could possibly have imagined, among the poorest of the poor. Before we move on, I would really appreciate it if you could give this video a like and share it with friends and family. If you're interested in history like this, please consider clicking the subscribe button to see more, and take a look at the channel page to discover a huge number of real and fascinating stories of everyday life in the past. If you would like to find out more about supporting us, check out the description for ways you can help us. Continue bringing the past alive. In the midst of a densely populated, and for the most part very poor district, Paddington Green has long lost all those suburban features which once made it fashionable, and its former wealthy inhabitants have fled further west, leaving their houses to be occupied by their poorer and less fastidious fellow creatures. Round these, again, have sprung up street after street of lodging houses, adapted to supply the demand if not the requirements of the poor. If, however, we take a wider circle, we pass westwards, at any rate, into a neighbourhood which is still wealthy, towering mansions, in which many a single room is larger than many a house on the other side of the Great Western Railway, rise on all sides as examples of the abodes of the rich, while within a stone's throw of their doors can be seen typical homes of the poor. The contrast is startling. Here, too, the difference can be so abruptly seen that it can hardly fail to impress the most careless observer. The immense gulf which exists between the rich and poor, and which some in vain seek to hide, is one of the most solemn lessons of daily life. Let some of those who live in the luxurious mansions of Bayswater and Paddington drive round by the banks of the Regent's Canal and see for themselves the way in which some of their neighbours live. The Paddington dust yards and their environs furnish many a rare example of the toilers of the West End, and of West End poverty. It seems, indeed, incredible that any of those who have sunk to the lowest depths could willingly work at such a calling as this. Its squalor, the wretched pay obtainable, and the hopelessly disgusting character of the work all seem to indicate that those who perform it can sink no lower in the ranks of labour. How difficult it is for the poor to earn a livelihood is one of the saddest truths of modern times. We are continually being brought face to face with abundant proof that work is neither easily found nor fairly paid for. In cities, the supply of hands is always greater than the demand, owing to the continual influx of countrymen and countrywomen, who are always being induced to throng thither from a too often delusive hope that their work is to be readily had. Poverty arises from an infinite variety of causes, and although of these vice is the commonest and most persistent, it is still true that many suffer every extreme of destitution through ignorance and misplaced hope. Ne'er-do-wells are not all idle and vicious, led by the glowing accounts of successful or mendacious friends to look upon London as the city of the golden pavement. Crowds throng thither in utter ignorance of the real horrors and hardships of London life. Dazzled with its glare and bustle, their days at first slip by uncounted, until their slender savings vanish away, and they find themselves face to face with poverty in London. We know how the dreary search for work too often ends, and then nothing remains for them but to beg their bread, or enter one of those wretched mongrel callings, in which, for a day's labour, the wage is a few pence. Such is the story of many a poor London toiler, and alas, our charity but too often turns the cold shoulder upon such a one, while it holds out its bounteous hand to the specious professional beggar. The toilers in Paddington dust yards are the poorest of the poor. Many of the sifters and sorters of the heterogeneous rubbish collected from household dustbins are women. They can be seen here by any visitor engaged in their loathsome occupation. The pay varies, but while it is higher in some yards, and for certain kinds of work, it is sufficient for our present purpose to say that, for a day's work, from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., most of the women receive 1 shilling. Such a fact is, in itself, abundant evidence that nothing but the direst necessity can fill the dust yards with crowds anxious to be taken on. When we remember that most of these women are mothers of families, many of which are wholly dependent upon them, and which have to be left in charge with a neighbour, or at a creche, we are at once confronted with an insoluble problem. Even the few pence for which a child can be lodged and fed during the working day must be a terrible drain upon such resources as these, and the mystery remains how these women keep body and soul together. Lessons in thrift must indeed be practical, if they are to be of any avail here. In the face of poverty, so abject as this, all known rules of economy must surely be found terribly wanting. We have already pointed out that there is no lack of labourers, but if it were possible to do away with such an avocation altogether, few of those who have the welfare of their fellow beings at heart could regret it. The fact that women are the most numerous workers here is, perhaps, explained by the low wage for which their services are obtainable. The statistics of female labour all point the same moral. The evidence is, indeed, conclusive that in almost every occupation followed by women the pay is wholly inadequate to the toil. The terrible difficulty which women have in getting anything to do, the comparative ease with which they can be overreached by their employers, the utter want of any regular scale of payment for a day's work, and the readiness with which they accept any sum, however small, almost without a murmur, all indicate the necessity which exists for legislation in favour of working women. Our factories and large workshops are subject to inspection. It is, too, illegal to employ children under a certain age, and the length of the working day is limited by law, but wages are fixed only according to the rules of supply and demand, and women are ill-fitted to help themselves in matters of this kind in the face of the fierce heat of modern competition and the terrible realities of poverty. A woman who has, under present conditions, her whole energy strained almost to the breaking point to keep starvation away from the wretched den she calls home, and who has resounding in her ears, waking or sleeping, the pitiful cries of her hungry little ones, cannot either fix her pay or choose her employment. Such is one obvious lesson to be learnt from the Paddington dust yards, but others suggest themselves with equal force. What, for instance, is being done to help these poor creatures? Day by day, thousands of prosperous and successful men pass close by these women at their work, on their way to business. Again, thousands of their more fortunate fellow women drive by on pleasure bent. How many of these give even a passing thought to these poor toilers? Some, it is true, may be in utter ignorance of their very existence. Others, again, who have seen them coming from their work, have, doubtless, shuddered at the sight of such wretched, squalid specimens of humanity and womanhood, and have afterwards related the episode in the light of a disagreeable adventure. To happy, careless girls, it might, indeed, seem as though these women were scarcely human, and the truth that in spite of, or rather by virtue of, their very wretchedness, they have a claim upon the large-hearted, open-handed sympathy and compassion which English women have always been so willing to extend to the scarcely less unhappy victims of slavery, and the sufferers by fire or flood in many a far-off land, is, it is to be feared, almost altogether forgotten. English sympathies are readily stirred, and English purses always opened wide at the call of distress abroad, but the West End districts of London forcibly illustrate the terrible want of systematic benevolence and sympathy towards our own poor. There are many workers in the East End who perform a great and good work in relieving and healing the destitute and the sick. From time to time, too, appeals are published on behalf of East End charities, but the poor of the West End are, for the most part, dependent upon promiscuous charity. There is a popular notion that the parochial funds are always sufficient in West End parishes to supply all the needs of the poor, and there is a widespread but most delusive idea that all West End parishes are inhabited by a majority of well-to-do, if not wealthy people, but that many a parish on the outskirts of a still fashionable neighbourhood is often sorely crippled in its resources, and that, in too many cases, the available funds are far from wisely bestowed, are facts which are well known to all those who have studied the question, and which are easily capable of proof by those who have not. It is not, however, only in or by the gates of the dust yards that poverty and misery are to be seen at Paddington. Let anyone walk down some of the narrow side streets and go into the yards in which the poor live, and they will find that vice and depravity have strongholds here. On Sunday nights, scenes of indescribable sadness can be witnessed, and a practical lesson be taken in the terrible effects of drink. This sad side of the story of the London poor has too often been told to need recapitulation, and yet it is our duty to add another voice to the mass of witnesses which is protesting before God against the besetting sin of the nation. No one can go amongst the poor without finding out with an ease and certainty, which are in themselves heart-rending, that but for drink there would not be 1/10 part of the poverty, misery, and crime which exist on all sides of all of us. The following episode, which is here given in the words of the lady in whose experience it occurred, who has long visited the poor round Paddington Green, is very graphic, and is also invaluable as illustrating the evil of indiscriminate charity. One Sunday afternoon I took some books and pictures and walked down one of the lowest streets in this neighbourhood. The boys were gambling, the men and women drinking, but as I went along the children came about me. I gave them pictures and spoke to them. Most of those to whom I gave them tore them up, and others called me names. Presently a woman came up to me, and in a whining tone, clasping her hands, and using some flattering words, such as that I was a lady and too good for the street, and so on, asked me, for the love of God, to come home with her and see her daughter, who was dying, and that she had not a bit or sup to give her. I consented. So she led the way, and I followed, and a filthy house truly it was. We mounted 3 flights of stairs, all reeking with odours vile, till we came to the top landing. We then went into a room in which there was a bed so large that one could but just walk round, save indeed that at the foot there was a little more space. Here there was a larger chair, placed by the fire, with a very handsome young woman in it, and close by sat 2 men. A tea-tray was set on 2 chairs in front of them, and on it a turbot half-eaten, and other eatables. The bed was covered with dishes, plates, and empty beer bottles. When the old woman ushered me in, she winked to the company, and the young woman at once took to a pose, lounged back in the chair, and coughed, and the men rose. "Londoners born," said I to myself, for a countryman would have sat still. They offered me a chair. Both men looked thieves. A queer pause ensued, and then the old woman said, "She's got up, but she's that bad." I saw that the girl was country-born, so I began to talk of the green of the country. It was a restrained and a curious talk, but I said openly that I thought she was not seriously ill or in want, but that it might do us good to look on and consider what hopes we had to meet death with when it came, and whether we should go forth to meet our Lord with joy. The men kept silence, but looked even more black and evil. The old woman held out her hand, whining for money, but the girl was affected, and begged me to see her again. Then the worst man broke out, and began threatening me. So I went away, followed all down the stairs into the street by him and the old woman. But I faced them, and held firm, and did not give. Such an incident as this throws into powerful relief the worst side of London poverty, the professional poor. If it were possible to obtain reliable information, it would doubtless be found that these vagabonds absorb an immense amount of alms, and leave but slender resources for those who are really deserving of help. Poverty in London is an inexhaustible subject. It takes an infinite variety of forms. In its most deserving shape it is not readily recognized. But the great necessity of the times is for better charitable organization, parochial, municipal, and national, for some means whereby the terrible gulf between rich and poor may be bridged over, and for a full recognition of the persistent truth that poverty is not confined to any district, that it exists on all sides, and that the selfish adage that charity begins at home is capable of a truer and better application.